Good morning. This is March 17th, 2026. Um, we're interviewing Fletcher Newton today in connection with the HEU deal that went from 1993 to 2013, also often called the Megatons to Megatons Agreement. Um, we the the Columbia School of the Columbia Climate School has a Institute for Advanced the consortium on cooperation, conflict, and complexity, which this deal certainly has aspects of all of those. And for before we start the interview, for future viewers, I'll just note that the what the HEU or megatons to megawatts agreement accomplished from those over those 2 decades was an agreement to remove 500 metric tons of highly enriched uranium from Russian nuclear weapons to dilute them down in the form they could be useful for reactor fuel, which was purchased by an agent of the United States for use in civilian nuclear reactors, producing roughly 10% of U.S. electricity over that period, um, and without carbon from the nuclear reactors. So it was an exemplary example of cooperation in the past, and we'll see if anything like it can be um, conducted in the future. The agreement rid about one-third of the Earth's nuclear weapons material, but there's still plenty left, and so imagination will be required down the road to address that persistent threat to humanity. So, and again, my purpose will be to have Fletcher do most of the talking, but just to give a little overview of his background, and I'll be very interested in how he got into his interest in Russia as we talk. But he went to Harvard in the 1970s. He capped his undergraduate studies with study at University of St. Petersburg, if memory serves, and then he, in a time for us, in a very timely way, entered. Uh, he also went to law school after that in the University of Denver, got his JD, and from there, in 1991, moved into the uranium field, and uh, with involving trade with the Soviet Union on uranium, and was there, present at the creation, watching the HEU deal idea be proposed and then begin to be implemented, and was intimately involved with uranium companies after that in the sales of natural uranium, which are linked, as we'll get into, with compensating Russia for natural uranium, which they had used previously in enriching their HEU and weapons. And so there was a trade that needed to be conducted, which turned out to be part of one of the most difficult parts of the deal. And uh, and Fletcher was intimately involved in the negotiations with the Russians after that, and then involved in other uranium companies with the Russians over the 2000s, and indeed, not long after the completion of the deal, worked with Tenex, which was the executive agent for the execution of the HU deal on the Russian side. So you kind of seen it all, Fletcher, and with that, I just got to ask you, how did you get interested in the Soviet field? I mean, I can understand. I mean, you were at Harvard in Soviet studies, and then you went on St. Petersburg and mastered the language. Be interested, like, where did you grow up, and how did the Soviet interest come up, and which shaped your life?
I grew up in Denver, went to public schools, and in junior high school, I had flunked French. And the teacher had told me, you're better off leaving languages alone. So when I got to high school, my sophomore year, 10th grade, I was a runner and actually a long jumper. And it turned out that the track coach was the college counselor. And he said, listen, if you want to go to a decent college, you really need a language. Well, I sure wasn't going to take French again. The Spanish class was full. And at that time, the Denver Public Schools offered Russian and German. I wasn't too interested in German, so I thought, well, what the heck? I'll take Russian. And I took 2 years of Russian in high school, my junior and senior year. And as a child of the Cold War, I guess I felt if there was any country on earth that I ought to try to learn a little bit about, it would be the Soviet Union. Um, I got to Harvard in the fall of 1973. Um, Pretty much started over again with Slavic A, took Russian for 2 more years. And after 4 years, still couldn't get past hello. I was in New York City visiting my brother in the spring of 1975, and a woman gets on the elevator with her kids. She worked at the UN, I guess. And I thought I said something like, well, it's a nice day. I have no idea what I actually ended up saying because she got back with something and I had no idea what she said. I thought, well, this is crazy. 4 years and I can't get past hello. So I talked to my teachers at Harvard and they said, you got to go to a language institute. So in the summer of 1975, I went to a place called Norwich Academy, which is in Northfield, Vermont. And all they taught back then was Russian. All the teachers were native Russian speakers. And that was the same summer that Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who'd recently won the Nobel Prize for literature, was kicked out of the Soviet Union. And he went at first to Zurich for a few days, and he came to the United States and immediately came up to Northfield, Vermont, because he knew several people who were teaching there. They'd been in the camps together.
Oh,
So here I am, not quite 20 years old, sitting across the table from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, listening to him talk.
wow.
And of course, I probably got 30% of what he said, but it was enough to alert me to the fact that what I had been hearing and studying at Harvard was very different from what Solzhenitsyn was saying about Russia, Russian culture. And remember, this is at a time of the Soviet Union. People didn't really talk about
Right.
Russia so much. And after that, I thought, wow, I really, I need to figure this place out. And again, this is very much, I think, the child of the Cold War syndrome.
Right.
Um, so I went back to Harvard for my junior year, and then what would have been my senior year, I was accepted to a program at the University of Leningrad at the time, and it was 30 students, 20 Americans, 10 Canadians. Very hard to get into the program because you had to demonstrate a real proficiency in the language. But thanks to the Summer Institute that I'd gone to at Norwich, I was able to do that. So spent almost a little over close to a half a year in Leningrad. And of course, that was the ultimate eye opener because I hadn't been there 5 days, um, but that I realized, my God, this system doesn't work. This is crazy.
It was the
And
Brezhnev
remember,
stagnation period, right?
oh yeah, and this was at a time, remember, when there had been my freshman and sophomore years at Harvard, there were demonstrations um, because the economic students, graduate students, the Department of Economics were upset because there weren't enough Marxist professors on the economy or in the faculty. So there was I guess, there was still a lot of, maybe you'd say, enthusiasm or interest in this experiment in the Soviet Union. And I right away could see, no, this is not working at all.
Right.
And to be there for that period of time and to see how the country really worked, that really opened my eyes. And of course, then I came back and thought, okay, well, I sure would like to be able to make a living doing something with Russian and my understanding of this culture. Um, I was a tour guide and translator for the next couple of years after I stayed at Harvard an additional year to write my honors thesis. So I actually didn't officially graduate until 1978 instead of class of 77, which I had been originally. So from 78 to 80, I was basically a tour guide translator in the Soviet Union, got to
Wow.
travel all over the country, and then started off at law school, first at Georgetown, and then transferred back here to Denver and graduated from law school in 83. Now, this was the first term of the Reagan administration. Things with the Soviet Union were not very good. So for the next 7 years, really, 6 years, didn't really, there was no business to be done in the Soviet Union.
Right. There was a downing of the Korean airliner. There was
Oh,
the war
absolutely. Just
scares in '83.
absolutely.
It
I
was
mean, one
the Cold
crisis
War.
after another. Yeah. And then in um, 1990, there was through people I had worked with at this law firm where I was working, um, they I, literally I bumped into them on the street, and one woman said, "You speak Russian, don't you?" And I said, "Yeah, well, you got to meet this guy I'm working for." And there was a guy out here named Orrin Benton who had begun trading Russian uranium. I didn't know anything about nuclear fuel. And I remember during the interview, I asked, "How do you make your money?" And the general counsel said, "Well, we trade uranium." And I thought, "You mean like bombs?" I mean, I had no idea. But that's how I got into the nuclear fuel business because even back then, and certainly now, there's a robust market in buying and selling and trading nuclear fuel, uranium, in its different forms. So that's where I met Jerry Grandy, to whom I owe really a lot of my career because Jerry then eventually hired me. This fellow, Orrin Benton, went bankrupt in late 95. I then took a job in Paris with a law firm, and then subsequently moved to Moscow. And I guess it was June of 1995, Jerry called me and said, "Look, would you be willing to consult for Cameco?" Because everybody knew about this HEU agreement, but it had not yet come to fruition. And I am delighted that you're gathering all this information, Jeff, because I think without question, and Andreas mentioned this earlier, that initiative, megatons to megawatts, I think is without question the most significant non-proliferation event in the entire Cold War. And I've
Wow.
always been surprised at how little publicity it got and how little people know about it. I mean, to take 500 metric tons of weapons grade uranium, enough for, I guess they figured, what, 20,000 nuclear weapons or something like that, and to downblend that and then use it to produce electricity for American ratepayers, American companies that are buying electricity from American utilities. I mean, that's just extraordinary. And so I was lucky enough then to be able to work for Cameco and obviously was part of the team that negotiated the feed contract, which was different from the original agreement.
Right. If I could stop you there for one moment, we'll certainly come back to Cameco. Um, but you mentioned Denver, which also happens to be very involved in the uranium trade in
Yeah,
Colorado. And you mentioned Orrin Benton, who, besides just being a uranium trader, was quite I don't, character is not the right word, but quite a force. He was involved. He owned a
yes.
National Football League team. I don't, um, you have anything kind of characterize his role because
Yeah.
his role played a consequences later down the road with some of his cooperative company with the
Yes.
Soviets.
Yes, absolutely. Orrin was had been a partner at Arthur Andersen. He was a tax partner. And my understanding is he opened the Arthur Andersen office here in Denver. He was a brilliant strategist for taxation issues and making the most of ways that you could reduce your taxes. And he had become involved with a guy named Bob Adams who owned a company called Energy Fuels. And Jerry had worked for Energy Fuels. Energy Fuels at one time was the largest U.S. uranium producer. I mean, they produced, gosh, 25 million pounds annually. I mean, it's an enormously successful company. And so Orrin got involved in the business of uranium, and then became involved with another company called New Exco that was trading uranium in different forms. And that's how he got involved in the business. And when I met him in 1991, they were already down the road and they hired me just as Orrin had created a joint venture with the Russians. There's always been just one entity in Russia that is allowed to sell fissile material for export, and that's called
Under
Textile
the
export.
Soviets.
Yes, yeah.
This was
It-
their ticket to the
exactly.
world commerce.
Exactly. So Texnob Export, which everybody calls Tenex, had created this joint venture with Orrin Benton called GNSS. And it was a Swiss corporation for tax reasons, but Orrin obviously wanted a lawyer who could at least speak Russian. And so that's why I was hired. Not
Mhm.
because I knew anything about the nuclear fuel business. I didn't know anything. But I did speak Russian. And so that was a big help to them to get this thing going. Orrin subsequently went bankrupt shortly after I joined the company in 91. In the fall of 91, an anti-dumping case was filed against, it was still the Soviet Union, hadn't fallen apart yet, but it was filed against uranium imports from the Soviet Union, as well as the importer, which in this case was Orrin's company, New Mexico. And that started a whole chain of events. And eventually, Orrin went bankrupt in, I guess it was late 95, if I'm correct.
I think it went into bankruptcy proceedings, which then dragged on for
Yeah,
some
but for
years.
years. In fact, they just finally, a little less than a year ago, they finally made the last ruling on some of the assets that were in the bankruptcy estate. But he was a force. He was smart, but he was one of these guys who just couldn't bring himself to realize that, wow, I'm in a real jam here. He would always, I could remember seeing him draw things up on the chalkboards, say, yeah, we've got enough here. Yeah, okay, we can cover it. When in fact he couldn't. And had he listened to some of the advice of the people around him, he probably could have saved the whole thing, but he didn't.
There's an interesting interrelationship here between domestic uranium mining, the anti-dumping suit that you mentioned while the Soviets Union still existed, and the subsequent implementation of the HEU agreement, which we'll get
Absolutely.
to. Is it the case there was 3 Mile Island in the in 79, I guess, and the uranium market took a hit because of that. Um, and I had the general understanding that what Benton did was that he went to U.S. utilities and was able to borrow their uranium to sell, and then he would replace that with the Soviet
Yes.
uranium.
Yep.
But he was very clever in the way he marketed it and was able to um, he would sell it for less than he bought it from, and so therefore he would make a profit, and
Yes.
it that drove down the domestic price, and then that created the domestic pressure to
Precisely.
shut that down.
Precisely. Uh, TMI obviously had a big impact on the uranium mining industry. And there are lots of different reasons why TMI and at that point, it had become impossibly expensive to build and operate new nuclear reactors. So you had hundreds of reactors that were canceled. Demand for uranium shrank dramatically, but it was still reasonably robust.
We still
And
had 100 reactors roughly, right?
yeah,
Yeah.
and Orrin, I mean, I was just amazed when I started working there and I found out that not only did Orrin own Energy Fuels, which had been, as I say, the largest uranium producer in the United States, but he also owned this other company, New Mexico, which published one of the two industry newsletters that came out every week and quoted whatever the current market price was. So I would see contracts where Energy Fuels was selling uranium and the price in the contract would refer to whatever New Mexico would be publishing in their weekly, monthly publications as far as the price goes. I thought, wow, that's interesting. You own the guys who are um, publishing the price. And Orrin, at this time, it was extraordinary, Jeff. It was possible to borrow uranium from utilities and provide very little collateral. Now, if you do that, you have to put up cash.
That was his idea, I guess. That was his innovation.
I think it was, and he was able to convince a lot of these utilities to lend him uranium on the basis of a letter from Energy Fuels, which he owned, which says, look, we got millions of pounds in the ground, and regardless of what happens, we can guarantee that you're going to get your uranium back. So he'd borrow that uranium from the utilities, he would sell it into the market at whatever the current market price was. And of course, the more he did that, that pushed the price down. Well, then he could get uranium from the Russians at a very attractive price because they were trying to sell everything they could and they were willing to give pretty good discounts. He would get that uranium back, return that to the uranium that he to the utilities he borrowed from. So imagine he could borrow uranium at, let's just call it $17 a pound, sell it at 17, and then get it back at a time when uranium was only costing maybe $14 a pound and make that delta. And of course, on millions and millions of pounds, this resulted in some pretty substantial profits. But it was at this point that the other uranium producers in the United States said, wait a minute, this is crazy.
He
Um,
was too clever by half.
yeah, and that's what led to the dumping case.
So the dumping case was initiated before 1991 and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
It was initiated right at the time. You know, the Soviet Union sort of officially collapsed at the end of 91, and the anti-dumping case was filed in, I think it was October of 91.
And the collapse was like December 25th.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
and so then it becomes a new and even more complicated problem that you were probably involved in terms of you're not
Yeah.
just in the Soviet Union, you've got Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan
Yes.
and and I believe Benton he was involved in trade with them as well.
Yeah, the dumping case was split up into six different cases now. So instead of being against uranium from the Soviet Union, it was against uranium from Russia, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan. The cases against Ukraine, Tajikistan, and Kyrgyzstan were subsequently dismissed. And so you were left with cases against um, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and Russia. And those continued. A year later, there was a so-called suspension agreement that was entered into, which suspended the anti-dumping investigation. Um, Kazakhstan and Ukraine eventually reached full agreement, so they were no longer subject to the terms of the suspension agreement. But that suspension agreement remained in effect and is still in effect even today. In fact, I had a call earlier this morning from the Nuclear Energy Institute asking about some provisions of the current suspension agreement. And Russia was and still is subject to the terms of that suspension agreement, which, as you know, added another layer of complexity to how do you go about implementing this HEU agreement, the
Right.
megatons to megawatts, because it all had to be done within the context of that crazy suspension agreement. That's why I say the fact that um, you in particular and Jim Timby and Ernie Moniz were able to overcome all of these remarkably complex and difficult obstacles and still get this thing implemented. I think it's extraordinary.
Well, certainly this is really, I think, very useful backdrop to when we get to the HEU agreement to better understand the problems that emerged because of all this complexity. Policymakers coming in didn't necessarily understand, I think, the full significance
Absolutely.
of the natural uranium backdrop here. Um, we never had an agreement for nuclear cooperation with the Soviet Union just because there was the Cold War and we were kind of
Hmm.
adversaries. It was apparently not a problem to receive natural uranium from Russia, but then once the HEU deal gets started, the whole question of compensating
Exactly.
Russia for their natural uranium contribution to the enrichment um,
Yeah.
involved either paying them, which then could affect the domestic market if it was sold by the U.S., or we'd have to bring it back as a physical quantity, and that wasn't yet in the cards. So
Yep.
that's
Yep.
if I may ask you, when do you recall when you first heard about the HEU deal proposal? Because it was in 1991, late 91, that Neff wrote his op-ed,
Yes. Yes.
and then in 92, because of that idea being out there and um, it resonating for a variety of reasons with some key Russians, Yeltsin pitched the idea to George W. Bush, 41st president, and then it was announced publicly in the summer of 92, August 92, that the Russians and the U.S. would seek to establish a contract within a year for the U.S. to buy an unspecified amount of uranium from Russian weapons. And so that with that idea out there at the presidential level, there was an effort to try to integrate the framework of a potential HEU agreement on weapons material um, with the natural uranium equation. I don't know if
Yeah.
I'll let you respond to those questions about
I,
where did you
yeah,
learn about it? What did you know
sure.
Neff, and how does that kind of affect the run up to the actual agreement, the governmental agreement, which was signed in 93, early 93.
Yeah. I first heard about it in the autumn of 92, and I remember exactly where I was standing.
Ah,
It was every morning, this New Mexico company, which was trading Russian uranium, they would have a conference call with all their offices. They had offices in Hong Kong, um, the UK, Switzerland, and I would sit in on these conference calls, not really understanding much of what they were talking about. But I remember after one of those calls, as we were walking out, the head of New Mexico, a guy named Earl Holan, mentioned this agreement because they were aware of that this thing is coming down the road. And he said, you know, if this happens, this is going to bring an enormous amount of uranium into the market. And the way it looks right now is the US government is going to buy all of this stuff and then sell it. And the fear was that if the US government, whatever that term meant, was to do that, uh, bottom line was going to be dramatically reduced prices for uranium. Now, this was after the dumping case had already been filed, and it was shortly after they had finally executed the suspension agreements. But yeah, that's when I first heard about it.
and so with the idea that there might be an HEU agreement,
Hmm.
um, and there were actually negotiations, which I was surprised I didn't know as much about at the time, that began essentially in February of 1992. Secretary Baker flew, or I guess it was after Camp David summit in February 1992 where the idea came up. He soon followed trip to Moscow and talked with their foreign minister, and small delegations got together to talk about in a very awkward way because it was such a new conversation for them to be having um, about buying Russian nuclear weapons material. Um, but they were able to establish a framework agreement for sufficiently for President Bush to announce the general idea in public in August 92. And so then that dovetails with in the Congress, there was longstanding disenchantment with the uranium enrichment industry in the U.S. and how it was run, and Department of Energy
Yeah,
was
yeah.
running it, and was it efficient enough? So there was kind of a dovetail plan to privatize the U.S. enrichment capability and dovetail that with the HEU agreement going forward. And my general sense is that some of the emission of the Russian natural uranium and uranium was going to be um, permitted for implementing the swords to plowshares deal, even though other parts of the walls against buying foreign uranium would remain in place. Is that roughly correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I don't remember when the decision was made, but it was in the context of this newly privatized entity, which was going to take over the U.S. enrichment business, right? The creation of USEC. And the idea was that instead of the U.S. government buying all of this downblended uranium, USEC could buy it or buy a part of it, and then the rest of the uranium could be managed or sold differently. So you're absolutely correct that it was a unique opportunity in the United States. In the United States, you got this newly created company or soon to be created company, USEC, and one of the ways that people realized that the U.S. government could help finance this thing was to allow USEC to purchase the enrichment component of the downblended HEU. So the Russians were planning to send over uh, enriched uranium in the form of UF6, and USEC would buy the enrichment component, which meant that the uranium component still had to be sold. And I don't remember when that decision was made. It didn't go over very well initially on the Russian side because they said, well, look, the deal was you guys were going to buy everything. Now you're just telling us you're going to buy part of it. Viktor Mikhailov, who was the minister, I think, by that time, likened it to somebody who goes in to buy a suit and the tailor comes out and he says, okay, well, here's the lining. That's all you're going to get. You're going to have to figure out the rest of the suit yourself. And he would use that example. But that held up the complete implementation of the agreement for several years because USEC was buying only the enrichment component. And the question was, well, what's going to happen to the feed, to the natural uranium? And as you pointed out, that couldn't be shipped back to Russia. So what are they going to do with it? And it was Cameco's role, as well as a French company at that time called Kojima, and a German company called Nuchem at the time, that eventually ended up buying that feed component. But that was a big issue. And I remember one of the very first meetings I went to with Jerry and the CEO of Cameco at the time, a guy named Bernard Michel, at Rosatom to meet with Mikhailov. And as we walked in, out comes the delegation from Kojima. And of course, Bernard Michel, being French, he knew all these guys and, hi, how are you? And I didn't know who these guys were. And I said to Jerry, who's that? And he said, well, those are the French. That's the competition. Because it was understood that something was going to happen to this feed component. And Cameco was smart enough to know, as were the French and others, that wow, if the Russians are the ones who have to sell that stuff into the market, that's just going to destroy the commercial market. So the
Yeah.
idea was for these companies, they would buy it and sell it in a more responsible manner to preserve the integrity of the natural uranium market.
My sense is that in the discussions between the Department of Energy and the State Department in the latter part of 1992, that USEC, I think the concept was announced in legislation to pair with the HEU deal if and when agreed to. But I think in the early days, the Russians had the sense, as you mentioned earlier, that they would get paid for the entire deal all at
Yes.
once. They'd be compensated. And so and I believe in the early negotiations for a contract with the USEC in 93, 94, they would get definitely compensated as they delivered the enrichment component, and then they would get compensated for the natural uranium at minimum by the end of the agreement, which is not very satisfactory, or if when it is used or sold. And there was another theory of the case that Tom Neff, who proposed the idea to begin with in late 91, there was a possible method for USEC to overfeed their enrichment capabilities that they could,
Yeah.
there's a trade-off between electricity and uranium. And so that would sort of get rid of the uranium, have a cost savings, and that might be a basis to compensate the Russians. Um, but for but USEC appears to have had different commercial motives going forward and incentives. And so there was sort of a tension between the um, making the compensation of Russia smooth going forward, and then the stand up and um, nascent preparations for the future U.S. executive agent, USEC, um, to looking forward to be privatized. So there was kind of a built-in tension, uh,
Yeah.
commercial and governmental at the beginning. Oh,
There was a tremendous amount of tension there. And again, one of the remarkable things about the HEU agreement in general is that now you've got this newly created private entity, USEC, and the obligation on the part of the government to try to help this thing survive. Um, and yet that injected another element of complexity to the implementation of the HEU agreement. And here again, I think the the folks at State Department and the Department of Energy did a remarkable job of figuring out how to accommodate all of these interests, including the interests of USEC, which related to the American enrichment industry at the time. How do you accommodate those interests and yet still implement this agreement? And the long and short of it was that USEC said, okay, we're going to just buy the enrichment component, and the feed component ended up being purchased, as you know, by Cameco, Kojima, the French company at the time, and Nuchem. But
well,
it was a long slog to get there. And you remember at one point, Senator Domenici from New Mexico, he said,
another uranium mining state.
"Yeah, the Russians had already been delivering now um, enriched uranium to the United States, and it was, I believe, for the years 95 and 96." The Russians, remember, they had only been paid by USEC for the enrichment component. Maybe it was 96, 97. Um, those years they had not been paid for the feed. And so Senator Domenici was able to pass legislation that basically purchased that feed component. Um,
Remember it well, yeah.
yeah, and that sort of kept the thing going. But we didn't really reach final agreement on that feed contract. That is to say, the contract between the three Western companies on the one hand and the Russians on the other hand, Tenex, their executive agent, to buy that feed. We didn't reach agreement on that until several years later.
That was, yeah, March 1999. If I can go back just a little bit, the theory of the case with USEC was that they were using Manhattan Project technology for enrichment, these gaseous
Yeah.
diffusion plants that used a huge amount of energy. And the centrifuge plan to replace them with more efficient technology, more cost efficient, um, was running into problems in the 80s, and that back was the background to the privatization urge. Did you when did you recall hearing about the Avalos replacement was supposed to be even more efficient than centrifuges, and that was an important part of the argument that yeah, we can accommodate the influx of Russian material for 2 decades, and meanwhile, this private entity will deploy Avalos. It'll beat any other enricher in the world, and therefore, once that deal goes away, they can just ramp up Avalos.
Exactly.
But the story ended up playing out differently. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
It did. The joke was we'll see Atlas the next time we see Elvis. Um, it it everybody knew about the theory behind laser-based enrichment, and it worked in the laboratory, but it has never worked, as far as I know, even now, when you bring it up to scale. And I can't remember when exactly. USEC acquired the rights to Atlas, and they had it for quite a while, but then they had to abandon it.
Right.
And as you say, they were using Manhattan era technology, these old gaseous diffusion plants, which used an enormous amount of electricity. And that's why the idea of overfeeding was so popular. What the utility eventually buys is enriched uranium, and that's a combination of enrichment and uranium. And you can produce the same amount of enriched uranium with either more uranium and less enrichment, or less uranium and more enrichment.
Well, that's your orange juice squeeze
There you go.
analogy. Harder you
And
squeeze it.
so if you have we likened it to orange juice. If you want to make orange juice, you have oranges and you have squeezing. The oranges think of as uranium, squeezing you think of as enrichment. So you can use a lot of oranges and just squeeze them a little bit and get a glass of OJ, or you can just use a few oranges and squeeze the daylights out of them and still get that same glass of orange juice. Same thing with producing enriched uranium. So because this technology that USEC had, these old gaseous diffusion plants, were so inefficient, one of the ideas, as you pointed out, was, well, let's just have USEC use more uranium and less enrichment to produce the same amount of LEU that they would then sell to the utilities. Well, that didn't work either, basically because that old technology at the two U.S. gaseous diffusion plants was so inefficient. USEC just found it more expedient to eventually shut them both down, which is what they did. But that meant that there was no enrichment now in the United States, and that we were reliant on enrichment, in this case, coming from Russia. Um,
So, so USEC, pursuant to congressional legislation in 92, was stood up for the first time in 1993 as a to be the U.S. executive agent. The agreement itself that emerged out of the negotiations started under Bush 41 was signed by Clinton. Well, was acknowledged to be signed by Clinton and Yeltsin in February 93 with Mikhailov, who you mentioned, the Minister of Minatom, formed just after the collapse of the Soviet Union from its predecessor, signed it with the General William Burns. And so that sort of set the governmental framework, and the commercial contract it took until the beginning of 94 for a variety of reasons to be signed in the early period.
right.
Partly because Ukraine heard about this idea and said, well, what about our compensation for our weapons? And that became tangled with the whole deal.
Yeah.
And indeed, an advance payment against its future performance to compensate Ukraine uh, through Russia.
Hmm.
Um, and I mention that only because, in part, for context, but so there was a governmental agreement, there was a commercial agreement by early 94, but as you pointed out, deliveries didn't start until later because it took time to
Yeah.
organize all this in Russia. How do you dilute the weapons and how do you do all
Yeah.
these arrangements? Um, and then we mentioned the domestic backdrop to the challenge of implementing the compensation for the feed as well as it not turning out to be USEC's decision to use the GDPs, as you just noted. Um, the 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 issue of compensation for natural uranium emerged increasingly through the mid 90s before USEC was privatized. So they kind of had to listen to the government because they had to approve it,
Yep.
US government. But they were still negotiating with Tenex on price and deliveries. And so anyway, the end game was for USEC to privatize, which kept getting pushed out of the future because there were some problems on getting sufficient confidence that USEC was going to act in the national security interest of the U.S. as opposed to their privatized interest, and they were still a government corporation. I'll
Yeah.
stop there and see if you have any comments on that.
I mean, I'm glad you mentioned this, Jeff, because again, to me, it's another example of how an agreement, which sounds very simple, um, and in theory became even more simpler because it was now it's going to be private industry. USAC's private company, they're going to buy part of it, and then these other private companies, they're going to do their part of it. But the amount of work that went on behind the scenes, the amount of work that was done at the Department of Energy, Department of State, Department of Commerce was extraordinary. And without all of those efforts, I don't think the agreement would ever have been implemented because, as you said, um, guys at the DOE, state, and commerce, they realized, okay, we're going to have to accommodate the interests of this soon to be privatized company, USAC. How do we do that? Obviously, we got to keep the Russians happy. So we got to figure out a way that they can get paid for everything. And we have to overcome all these other obstacles that we've got out there, like the dumping case. Um, it's very easy sometimes to say, oh, well, we'll just let private industry do it. In the nuclear industry, I just don't think that's feasible. Things are a lot more expensive, and they, as you just pointed out, they get complicated very quickly. And so that behind the scenes work that was done by the Department of Energy, that was done by the Department of State in particular, that's again, to my mind, it's one of the best examples of U.S. government operating at its very best because the guys at the DOE and state, they understood all of the issues. The commercial companies, at least on the feed side, Cameco, Kojima, and Nuchem, we just saw our little part of it. USAC might have had a little better understanding, but again, they were now a private company. So it really took the cooperation and the aggressive um, intervention from DOE and state, and ultimately DOE earning monies to make this thing happen.
You remind me also that we can't fail to mention Senator Domenicy's interest in this. He was extraordinarily powerful senator, Appropriations Committee, the Budget Committee, and he was an advocate of privatizing the U.S. enrichment capability, but he was also very mindful of the value of the HEU agreement and indeed other cooperative programs with Russia to prevent their the collapse of a Soviet nuclear empire becoming a loose nukes problem.
Yeah.
Um, and do you recall you might have accompanied Jerry Grandy or others to some of the meetings with Alex Flint, Domenicy's
Yes.
staffer, or I don't know if
Yeah.
you have any comments on.
Alex was Domenicy's chief of staff and absolutely no nonsense, cut right to the chase kind of guy. And at the time, I don't know
He
how
was about
old,
25 years old at the time.
but
It's
he had
amazing. I agree
it is.
exactly.
I mean, he had a level of maturity about him. And over the years after that, he worked at the Nuclear Energy Institute. And whenever Alex was going to give a presentation of any sort, I always made certain to be there because he was not only among the best informed, but he was able to express things in clear, cogent, succinct phrases that left you with an understanding of, oh, okay, I really know what's going on. So, yeah, early on, we met with him and he just would get right down to it. And as you say, Senator Domenici, a remarkable guy who not only cared greatly about the U.S. industry and the importance of uranium mining coming from New Mexico, for example, but he also understood the larger context. And here again, this was something that Department of Energy, Department of State, they had to work collectively with the Congress, with guys like Domenici. Again, it was another layer of complexity that had to be dealt with. We on the commercial side, that's to say the companies buying the feed component, we would stay up to date on that and offer whatever suggestions we could. I remember having meetings with Alex Flint and suggesting this or that. Um, but he was, and I'm not sure what he's doing now. I hope to God he's not retired because he was just one of these guys who was really sharp. The more I worked with him, the more I came to admire him, and the more I could see why Domenici made him his chief of staff.
As an aside, there, I believe Alex, one of his current occupations is with a sort of a bipartisan NGO designed to focus on climate change, sort of
Perfect.
trying to gather Republicans that support that in terms of go a path forward.
Yeah,
Um, One thing your remarks remind me of all was during that period of the early 90s, Tom Neff was involved in talking with the companies, and he would send sometimes it seemed like daily, very informative memos to me, to Alex Flint, to Jim Timby,
yeah.
and he was and he was involved in interactions with the Russians as well as the industry. I don't know if you have any comments on your um, engagement with Neff or seeing some of his memos, or perhaps they went to
You
Jerry
know,
Grandy
Tom,
or others.
sure, Tom was one of these really unique characters who, as a nuclear physicist, had a detailed understanding of what it would take to downblend um, weapons grade uranium into commercial grade uranium that you could sell. But he also understood the market reasonably well. And so he was able to make comments both on the technical side of it, which became very, very important for the Russians, and also on the commercial side. And I know Jerry would make it a point to try to meet with Tom or talk to him on a regular basis. Cameco, as the one North American party in the commercial agreement to purchase the feed, Cameco really took the lead, and Jerry very much took the lead. And I can remember several instances, even after we'd signed the agreement, of decisions had to be made to keep this thing alive. And Jerry was really the driving force behind this. The guys at the French company and the German company would typically follow his lead. And as I say, Jerry, I know, spoke to Tom on several occasions. I met Tom many, many times, a delightful guy, but I found that when he would begin to talk about the more technical side of down blending and this sort of thing, I couldn't keep up with him. Um, I'd say, just Tom, draw me a picture. And he's, well, it's not quite that simple, but no, he was critically important for the obviously creating the idea in the first place. But because he had so much credibility with the Russians as a physicist, and in particular with Mikhailov, who was also a physicist, that
Theoretical
really
physics.
enabled him to play a much more active role in getting this thing, not just to get it going, but to keep it going.
Yeah, no, Tom was a very good writer, and his memos were very clear, and he was, at least in his written form, he was able to distill it, in a form I think useful for
Absolutely.
policymakers and congressmen alike. Um, it reminds me that the we've talked about the difference between the enrichment component and the natural uranium component. There were negotiations to get the deal going between USEC and Tenex, both the executive agents for their respective countries. Um, Even after the contract was signed, I believe the negotiations over price were annual at the time.
Yeah.
And so USEC's interest would be to get the best, lowest price from Tenex, whereas part of the U.S. government's interest in having the deal at all was to get reasonable compensation to the Russian nuclear establishment that it didn't implode. It wasn't an interest in keeping their weapons capability honed, but it was a question of preventing leakage out of their complex.
Yeah.
Um, and there were some controversies in the mid 90s, as you refer to that tumultuous period, where I think the Mikhailov in 95, 96 offered to sell even more HEU in that year that than USEC was willing to take for whatever reasons, or was uncertain if the downblending had been perfected yet and didn't want to. And that became a front page New York Times kind of scandal. And that,
Yeah.
as you mentioned, Domenici got engaged. Um, and Mikhailov would come to the US and he would complain about this in the press and the like. And at some point, I don't remember exactly when offhand, the if Russia didn't get compensation for the natural uranium, then their laws under Yeltsin to prevent corruption would kick in, and they wouldn't be able to send the enriched component even if they wanted to. And so
Exactly.
there were
Exactly.
a number of instances in the mid 90s before USEC was yet privatized, um, where the shipments from Russia would stop and they'd stop getting compensation, which would could drag on for some months. Uh,
Yeah. Yeah. And again, Jeff, you mentioned another issue, which was, the term loose nukes. I was living in Moscow from 95 to 97
oh,
and consulting with Cameco already at that time. Was not a full-time employee yet, but I was consulting with them on the HEU agreement and how it might be possible for Cameco to buy some or all of the feed that was still not clear what's going to happen to this stuff. How's Russia going to get paid for it? And here again, it took the people at the State Department, Department of Energy, who realized there's a much bigger issue here, which is that Russia needs this money. You got a lot of people within Minitom at the time, within this enormous ministry, who haven't been paid.
mhm.
Something's got to be done here. And again, another example of how um, Department of State, Department of Energy could see the much bigger issue that the commercial parties, USEC, the three Western companies buying the feed, couldn't see. And it took the leadership and the creativity of um, uh, Department of Energy and the State Department to move this thing forward. Um, Again, one other level of complexity at that time because the USSR had broken up and the country was in complete economic and social chaos. And it made it even more difficult, but also more important to get this thing going and make sure the Russians got paid.
This issue of getting paid, it reminds me that um, the Benton New Exco bankruptcy and Mikhailov was a deputy minister in Manhattan's predecessor at the time. They got shorted, I think it was roughly $100 million from the Benton transaction. So that's part of Mikhailov's mental furniture in approaching the negotiations with
Yeah,
USEC, that you can end up with a short end of the stick.
absolutely. They lost over, I don't remember what the exact number was, but it was over $100 million that Russia lost because of that bankruptcy. Um, the Ukrainians, I can't remember. I can't remember if they were paid everything. They might have lost some money. I was still obviously working for Benton at the time um, of the bankruptcy. And leading up to it, we were able to get the Kazakhs and the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz and the Tajiks. They all got paid. Um, but I remember it was a pretty dicey time, and I ended up taking over a lot of the negotiations on behalf of Warren because I knew he couldn't do it. Um, and distinctly remember meeting with the attorneys for those four countries. Um, and I remember in particular, the attorney from Tajikistan, he was Italian, and he had a very high voice like this. And I told him that we were going to pay him, but it was going to be late. And he said, "Well, I'm so sorry to hear this. Please tell Mr. Benton I'm going to drink his blood."
Wow.
And I thought, well, okay.
From Sicily.
Yeah, I'm not sure how, but they eventually did get paid. Yeah.
I believe in my research for my book, there were interviews with Russian officials or Soviet officials that Benton at some point warned, it must have been Russian officials, warned um, that they needed to restrain what they were selling, otherwise it would provoke the dumping suit. But even the Russian minister at the time, basically their short-term pressures were so great they kind of
Yeah,
so it was kind of a race to the bottom on terms of price, just because they
yes,
needed any cash they could get.
absolutely.
So
And that was another factor which I think contributed to the success of the HEU agreement is that Russia needed money, and Minatom, Ministry of Atomic Energy, it desperately needed money. And so that was another incentive for them to enter into the agreement. And then, of course, added greatly to their frustration when once they thought they had an agreement, then they only find out that, well, you're just going to get paid for part of it. And as I say, that would just frustrate the daylights out of Mikhailov. And every time he would come to the United States, we would meet with him. He and I became quite close. He got a big kick out of the fact that my last name was Newton. Um,
A physics
uh,
unit of measure.
oh yeah, yeah. He never called me Fletcher. He always called me Newton, Newton. Uh,
Were you subjected
but
to his cigar smoking or
uh,
cigarette smoking?
oh, he smoked cigarettes one after another. And he was one of these guys who was naturally strong. I mean, you could just tell by looking at
Yeah,
him.
yeah, had kind of a bull.
And he could start drinking at 10 o'clock in the morning and smoking cigarettes, and he would go all day. And oftentimes, when he would come to New York, to Washington, he liked going to these strip clubs. And I remember once meeting with him, and somebody came in from the um, Russian embassy and gave him a brown paper bag full of $5 bills, which I guess he could give to the strippers. Um, yeah, he was quite a guy, difficult to keep up with.
In the 90s, in and maybe there were commercial motivations partly behind this, but the press about him was often, kind of shady and had too expensive a watch and so on. It was so interesting to research later just what an accomplished theoretical physicist he had been,
Yeah,
and the people that he studied with in Russia and passing competitive exams to get into. I mean, he served on at Artemis 16, which was the sort of the Los Alamos
yeah.
of the Soviet Union, and oversaw like 100 nuclear tests above
Oh,
ground,
yeah.
underground. And so, um, he kind of disdained politicians, whether they were Russian or the U.S., and he felt very confident in his own person. And so anyway, the and I believe he actually moved back from the test site to Moscow to sort of headquarters Manhattan, and partly from what I've read from interviews of people who knew him, to accommodate his wife, who didn't like being out in Novozemlya or in Kazakhstan. And so, I mean, just to balance out your example there. I mean, um, he obviously cherished his wife and lived in a modest apartment. I later learned in Moscow, as opposed to some grandiose thing that would
Yeah.
follow from the idea that he was wearing a real Rolex as opposed to maybe, just a knockoff. And um, but
He, he was not a flashy guy like that. I don't recall ever seeing a Rolex or diamond encrusted Patek Philippe on his wrist.
there were articles about that, and indeed, interview with the then Secretary of Commerce would complain about Mikhailov coming in and threatening her and having his Gucci this and his Rolex that. And so anyway, she clearly noticed,
He
but
might have indulged, I guess, in a little bit of that, which is understandable. I mean,
because
so
she noticed, after all, the Commerce Secretary. I mean, it's a way of signaling that you know, we're not decrepit.
yeah, yeah, this was Hazel O'Leary, I think. But you're correct, Jeff, that he had great disdain for politicians. He also had disdain for, let's say, people on the commercial side of these agreements. And I remember we met with him once, Jerry and I think it was just the two of us. And this was leading up to the negotiations on the feed agreement. And he said, "Oh, that's right. I know why you guys are here. Yeah, you want the feed. You're like little cockroaches in a glass, chasing each other to see who can get the feed." And of course, this is all in Russian. And Jerry leaned over to me and said, "Well, what did he say?" I said, "Well, don't take this personally, but he just called you a cockroach." Um, and but he said it not maliciously, certainly said it with a smile, but he did have some disdain there. Now, as things moved on, he began to realize that wow, maybe there is a lot of money available here, and gee, maybe I could make a little extra money. But this was a new concept for these guys, like the ability to wear Gucci shoes or have a really nice wristwatch, because for so long they'd been told they lived better than anybody else in the Soviet Union, which was probably true, but they'd also been told they lived better than anybody else in the world. And when they finally got to travel outside the Soviet Union, they realized, oh my God, there really is a gold encrusted, diamond encrusted Rolex that I could buy and stick on my wrist. And so this was a new thing for so many of them. And, Mikhailov, I think being human, naturally probably indulged in a little bit of that. But as you say, lived in a modest apartment in Moscow and was still of that Soviet mentality, which tended to downplay the importance of um, really fancy wristwatches or, $5,000 custom-made suits. He didn't go down that road too much. He started to a little bit with Mr. Shusterovich, and that eventually got set aside, and he was replaced by Yevgeny Adamov.
Just to um, comment on that for a moment. Um, I After the perturbations in the mid 90s of USEC not shipping or not coming to agreement on price or lack of compensation on natural uranium leading to interruptions of the deal, um, I believe there was a provision in the budget for Russia and Menatom, and which the HEU deal proceeds were basically became the budget for Menatom. They kind of didn't get it from the
Yeah,
state, and so that was
yeah,
intimately linked to their well-being. And I believe, and this may have been Mikhailov's cleverness, he arranged in his internal negotiations to have the compensation for the enrichment component go to Menatom and the natural uranium component, when resolved, would go to the Ministry of Finance. So he took what was available and
yes,
then used, I think, in his public, I think he was kind of aware that the underlying dynamics of the problem. But you mentioned um, Mr. Shostarovich, and there was a during one of these interruptions of the deal, Pleiades, which had an advisory group of notable Americans, but with at its core Alexander Sustorovich being kind of the commercial operator. I think that part of Mikhailov's motivation was to try to propose an entity to market the natural uranium component and
exactly.
get it back to Menatom, um, and that working with somebody he trusted was better, could be better than working with um, the commercial enterprise.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Shusterovich, a very interesting guy. He had left the Soviet Union with his family. His parents were Jewish, and so Jews at that time were the only people who could really leave the Soviet Union.
And I believe his
Um,
father was a chemist and knew Mikhailov.
and exactly, exactly. And so Alexander, young kid, grows up in the United States. I think he went to Harvard as an undergraduate, and then he um, went to Harvard Law School and was admitted to their joint JD and then MBA
MBA.
program.
Mhm.
So a very smart guy, and obviously spoke perfect Russian, and knew Mikhailov quite well. And so initially, you're absolutely correct. Mikhailov was smart enough to realize, okay, well, here's a way that we could um, sell the feed through an entity that at least I know and I trust, namely Shusterovich. And as you pointed out, Mikhailov had been smart enough to realize, okay, the money for enrichment, that justifiably can go to Minatom. The money for the uranium, uranium being an asset of Russia, that really ought to go to the Ministry of Finance. And so this was another iteration of how the deal could be implemented. And again, I'll go back to it again. This was another headache I could imagine for the Department of Energy, Department of State. Okay, well now how are we going to do this, right? With this new role and this guy Shusterovich, and he was a very smart guy, but he had an ego that wouldn't fit in the uh, you know Yankee Stadium. I mean, he was not a pleasant guy to deal with. And eventually that whole agreement ended up being sidetracked because I think there was concern that while Mikhailov might have thought highly of Shusterovich, nobody else did.
My
Um,
recollection was that the companies were uncertain about the value of his involvement, but more importantly, the clarity of um, being given the authority by the state to actually sell the uranium,
exactly,
and
exactly.
and do you recall being at meetings where Pleiades would show up and then what would happen, or because of this contractual the question of not um, becoming involved in a deal that couldn't be justified in just how it was papered even.
Sure, as I said, Shusterovich had a titanic ego, and from the very first introduction of Pleiades into the whole process, and Pleiades was his company. He would strut into meetings, um, giving the impression that, hey, we're going to be the ones to sell the feed. And if you guys are interested in it, well, you got to talk to me about this. And eventually, he had initially started talking to the German company, Nuchem, and was going to work through them. That didn't go anywhere because the parent owners of Nuchem didn't like him, and they eventually ended up firing the U.S. president of Nuchem, a guy named Nick Kazmarad, because of that. And they said, "Look, we don't want you dealing with this guy Shusterovich, and we don't want to be the only company that's going to be buying the feed agreement." I was still living in Moscow at the time, and I was given the task of trying to I don't want to say subvert, but to point out to the Russians at Tenex why this was not a good deal for the feed agreement to go entirely to Nuchem. And I remember going over to the Tenex offices late one afternoon. It was snowing, and was able to talk to all the guys I knew at Tenex and explain to them why this was not such a good idea. And then eventually, Cameco lined up together with Kojima and Nuchem together. And, Shusterovich was trying to play one off against the other. And we were having a meeting in Washington, D.C. at the Fairmont Hotel. And I remember Shusterovich coming in, strutting into the meeting, only to find that all three companies were sitting on one side of the table and he was going to be sitting on the other side. And you could see his ego get deflated pretty quickly there because he realized that he wasn't going to be able to play one off against the other. Pleiades had no idea how to sell uranium. And so their hope was, all right, we'll get the feed and then we can sell it to these commercial companies, Cameco, Nuchem, and Kojima, and make a profit that way. Well, that went to hell, and Shusterovich was pretty soon out of the deal, as was Mikhailov.
Yeah, Mikhailov was replaced in, gosh, I think it was like March of 1998, and partly against the backdrop of controversies over um, the, the shipments being stopped and revenue stopping and the like. Um, one one factor that I didn't appreciate sufficiently until later was I think there was a certain narrative in the U.S. that Mikhailov um, could be corrupt, and he was trying to do this side deal for his own commercial interest as opposed to the institutional ones that we talked about and kind of
Yeah.
getting um, where when in fact his environment domestically was far more complicated than I understood with the oligarchs because
Yes.
the oligarchs owned banks and they wanted to kind of wrestle away from Mikhailov,
Yeah.
bank that would control the revenues. I don't know if you have any
Yeah.
thoughts on
Well,
that.
you're absolutely correct. And I think one of the biggest problems for Mikhailov was the way Shusterovich went about conducting business. Um, they would routinely travel to Switzerland and stay at the most expensive hotels. Shusterovich in Moscow would travel around in a convoy of uh, large Mercedes-Benz, funny box-like cars with bodyguards. And Shusterovich had acquired the distribution rights, for example, to for Hustler magazine in Russia. And so the image he conveyed did not speak well to somebody who was interested in selling nuclear fuel. He came across as a brash, arrogant guy who, like I say, was selling Hustler magazine. Now he's going to sell uranium. At the same time, as you point out, the banks were quite worried about this. And I remember Jerry and I had dinner one night. Well, I can't remember his name, but he was we call him a junior oligarch. He was with, I think, Alpha Bank, which at the time was one of the largest private banks in Russia. And he explained to us how important it was to make sure that this money that would be going to Russia, and again, in this context, now we're talking about the money for the feed component, that it would go to a responsible bank. And he was just as worried as anybody else that if Shusterovich was the guy controlling this, who knows where it would go or how much of it would go. And they nobody was happy with Mikhailov's infatuation with Shusterovich. Mikhailov just couldn't, for whatever reason, see what a terrible image this guy presented, and why it was that just his presence, Shusterovich's presence alone, just reeked of corruption. Whether it was there or not didn't really matter. But all
I
you
mean,
had to
yeah,
do was
I
look at
think
the guy.
both Mikhailov and Shostakovich got some bad press in that period in a way
I'm sure they did.
because Shostakovich is the Pleiades is actually like a publishing company that publishes scientific journals. And in fact, I believe to this day, um, it sort of has a monopoly on Soviet scientific publications
You're absolutely right.
and just like the Mikhailov corruption spin, I think was, but it had consequences as you just describing in the moment, about the way they were perceived.
Yes.
Um, and indeed, there was sort of a non-coordinated letter campaign because it was a summit. Um, there was a there was an occasion for a high-level meeting. I can't remember if it was presidential or vice presidential, right before Mikhailov's departure or right in that time frame. And there were letters from U.S. senators and the like to the president Clinton and to Russian ambassador, worrying about the the Pleiades factor in the deal, without appreciation for the difficult oligarchical conflict that Mikhailov was maneuvering in, a complex environment in Moscow, as well as his own, kind of institutional incentives. But so he basically either resigned or was fired or retired by agreement to become a deputy minister in charge of
Yeah.
science at Artemis. And then, as you say, Minister Adamov comes in, and he is from the Kurchatov Institute, more of a nuclear power baron in the system as opposed to a weaponeer. And
Yeah.
the challenge then becomes, and this is when the Department of State and DOE involvement increased um, with you all and the companies to try to figure out how to get back on track on the natural uranium component to put the deal back on a sound footing.
Yes. And we had, by this time now, you can imagine the Russians are very frustrated. And I can remember meetings I always did all the translating from obviously Russian to English, which is easier because English is my native language, but I would translate also from English to Russian, and the
I
Russians
remember,
had
yeah.
a good enough like appreciation for what I was saying because many of these guys actually spoke pretty good English. But they were extremely frustrated. And I remember a meeting we had in Washington at the Russian embassy. And Vinograda was there, and Kuchinov was there. Mikhail Ryzhov was not there yet. He joined a little bit later. But
He was head
Kuchinov
of the
spoke,
international department at Manhattan,
yeah.
and
And
Kuchinov was his deputy.
there you go. And Kuchinov spoke perfect English. But I remember um, after the meeting, he came up to me and said, well, listen, I really appreciate the way you translated that because I think you really got across to Cameco and Kojima. Nuchem had not yet joined the consortium. I think you got across the idea to them of how frustrated we are and how important it is that we figure this thing out because it's going to hold everything up. And there's a lot of money at stake, and we're going to do everything we can to help you guys, but you guys have to ultimately agree on the commercial terms of buying the feed component. And that was the challenge for the two companies, Cameco, Kojima, and then when Nuchem came along as the third party in that. That was the challenge. And that's again where Jerry really took the lead. But again, it finally took Ernie Moniz and I say this without any exaggeration. It took him literally to get together with the three companies and I wasn't in the meeting, unfortunately, but slam their heads together and say, look, God damn it, you got to get this thing done. And that's how it played out.
Yeah, there was upon Adamov coming into office, he I think he tasked Ryzhov with a review of how to implement the agreement, and and their proposition was from Ryzhov, well, can't we just revert to the former governmental agreement and just get compensated from the U.S. government budget, whether it's Defense Department or, and that was, and Neff had to explain to Ryzhov that no, that wasn't in the cards when the deal was signed. It was going to be implemented by commercial means, and
Yeah.
the politics weren't there. And so then there began a whole process that involved the companies and meeting with Ryzhov and Kuchinov to try to,
Yes.
I think there was, as the situation became more urgent, um, in fact, there was a summit in there between Clinton and Yeltsin at which the Russians, they were so frustrated, to your point, Yeltsin kind of threatened to pull out of the deal.
I remember that.
And then that spurred a getting together between Moniz and Adamov in Vienna. And there was a document that came out, the Vienna report, in the days before the internet, that tried to walk Adamov through the history of, well, you agreed it was going to be a commercial agreement. It set out the history, and that energized this process for the State Department and Department of Energy to work with Manhattan and with the companies to try to figure out a path forward that
Yeah.
eventually um, led up to well, there's a Paris meeting in late 1998, which you may have some. I remember you translating in that one. There may be some interesting comments, and that sealed the commercial deal. And then there was the March 1999 signing ceremony, which had other complications. I don't know if you have any
Yes.
comments on either of
Yes.
those efforts to repair the feed component part of the deal to put the whole deal back on track.
Yeah. Well, I remember Ryzhov when he took over the negotiations. Um, we were in the meeting and he said, I can't remember if he said it in English or Russian. He spoke very good English. And even though I was translating, he and I would often argue about my choice of words.
He would correct you or something.
He would correct me, and then I would correct him, which didn't always go over so well. But he started off by saying, "Look, it's a new day, okay, and everything that's gone before, that's irrelevant. We start today with me going forward." And that's what eventually led to the agreement being signed. But there was also at that time the realization on the Russians' part that they needed to receive some of that feed component back to continue the downblending. Initially, that had not been something that they needed. And I remember meeting with the head of Tenex at that time, who was a guy named Smirnov, um, and he told me that no, we're going to have to change this thing a little bit. We're not going to be able to sell this much feed component to you guys. We have to get a big chunk of this stuff back. And I remember immediately sending Jerry a text or an email about this to say, wow, this is important because these guys have just pulled an enormous amount of uranium out of the market, which it was assumed Cameco, Kojima, and Nuchem would have to sell. Well, now they weren't going to have to sell because it was going to go back to Russia to facilitate additional downblending. And that here again was another element of complexity that, as you pointed out, by the time we got to the signing ceremony, well, we're going to have to change this thing a little bit. And we eventually made the changes. But again, I think it took the involvement of Secretary Moniz at the time, because the commercial side, Jerry's a tough negotiator. And I think even though Kojima and Nuchem were willing to go along with him, at times I can remember the guys from Nuchem leaning over to me and saying, we ought to take this deal. Let's just take it, move on. But Jerry continued to hold out. And as I say, it was Secretary Moniz who had the force of character and all the other information that he had, the much bigger picture that you described earlier. He could see that. And so that's what initially led to the agreement in Paris. We, I think, went out for dinner. It was like 4 in the morning or something. Somebody found a brasserie that was open, and okay, now we got the deal. But then when it comes to signing, we had to make some changes. We got that taken care of, and the thing went forward.
I remember the Paris meeting was late December 98, and it was in the Grand Hotel in Paris. And I remember you
Exactly.
translating.
Yeah.
There was the companies on the right side from the horseshoe end of the table, the Russians on the left, and then you were there was discussion back and forth across the room that we were kind of monitoring as the we Moniz had convened a meeting in Washington before that, and the proposition became, um, is there a way to return some of that natural uranium component directly to Russia in the absence of a 123 agreement for nuclear
Yeah.
cooperation, which, as mentioned before, had never been agreed with the Soviet Union for obvious reasons. But now the fly in the ointment was first Mikhailov's and then Adamov's interest in continuing their nuclear commerce with Iran, which we always had polarized views
Exactly.
about Iran since the revolution.
Yeah. And I remember one of the few times I met with Jerry, and we met with Jim Timby at the Department of State, and he raised that issue. Here again, another example of more complexity. This was a headache for the Department of State. I would assume for DOE as well. Okay, well, how are we going to accommodate this when the Russians keep saying they want to complete the construction of the reactor at Bushehr and supply the fuel? Um, how do you get all that done?
Yeah, so there was a whole debate with Adamov on the ground rules for nuclear commerce with Iran that complicated the relationship in general at the highest levels in the
Yeah,
U.S. Um, so the despite that problem with Iran, the deal was so important for its different reasons on the side of Russia and the U.S. preventing loose nukes and preserving their nuclear enterprise securely. The interests were sufficient to override even the angst on Iran, unlike other um, agreements that were discussed that fell by the wayside. The and creative lawyers came up with a way to um, have not a full-fledged agreement for nuclear cooperation with Russia, but a very targeted one, specifically to be able to return natural uranium to Russia, which if it was not sold, I guess you can speak more to the commercial contract, but the idea was the Paris Agreement was really about the price that the two sides, Manhattan, Tenex, and the companies would agree to how to sell it, and that which was unsold, which was resident in the United States, would be returned physically to Russia and then
Correct.
held in a stockpile that they could either use for domestic enrichment purposes,
Right.
or or it would be transparently observed that it was off the market.
Yeah. And
And
I
that was
think
one
the,
issue. And the other issue was I think the company's insistence, and this was Jerry's hard bargaining. Um, they they wanted to get a presidential decree that only the companies had the exclusive right to do this and not um, other actors, such commercial actors such as Pleiades, and that needed to be approved by
yes,
Prime Minister.
yes. And that, in fact, that they did get an executive order to that effect because Pleiades said, well, we're going to sue you guys. We're going to hold up the whole thing. And the executive order eliminated that threat. And as I recall, and I don't remember exactly the wording that we used because I was, one of the lawyers on the Cameco team. Um, the idea was that this feed component um, had never really entered the United States. And so it was whatever was going back to Russia was not subject to the requirements of having a 1, 2, 3 agreement with Russia and the United States at the time. And so that enabled the return of the feed. And I can't remember if we did it um, via swaps, but eventually, they began to send feed back to Russia. And of course, that was all handled by Tenex USA, 10AM as it was called at the time. And several years later down the road, in 2014, it was the head of 10AM, Tenex-USA, who was arrested because he was shaking down one of the transportation companies that was sending feed back to Russia, trying to get money from them. And that's how the Russians ended up hiring me in 2014 to be the president of that company. Um, so there was a long, long history here of, again, all the complexities involved, not just on the commercial side, but more broadly in the question of international relations, Iran, loose nukes, all these things that it really, I mean, the Department of Energy and the Department of State, but especially DOE, played a remarkably active role, and I don't think has ever received nearly as much credit as they should have received for having kept this thing alive. And then once it got signed, keep it going.
Just for historical reference, the reason that there were constraints, U.S. legal constraints, domestic constraints on the shipment of natural uranium was that it was deemed source material.
Yeah,
And because in the Manhattan Project, natural uranium was very rare. And
yeah.
now in this case, the judgment was made, well, um, downblending HEU from Russian nuclear weapons outweighs the the risks of sending natural uranium to Russia. And so there was the transfer agreement was the general sort of label that was applied to this, and there was NRC authorities that would enable to do this for the
Yeah.
specific purpose. Um, and
And I would
then,
imagine, Jeff, you correct me if I'm wrong here, but that was really something that the DOE took upon itself to get worked out.
well, there were discussions in these Washington meetings with Rizhov and Kuchinov, um, who had been served in Vienna in the IAEA and had a kind of a broad perspective and deep
Yeah.
technical expertise as well. Um, the concept of that return to Russia came up, and I think Timby, when Adamov had raised this return idea, he had sort of gotten some of the State Department staff thinking about it and their legal
Mhm.
people and the NRC as well. And so we ended up enlisting the NRC at the Washington meeting. And so the task really became how to draft the details of that transfer agreement. Plus, um, there were separate negotiations with Jerry and Secretary Richardson and Moniz and and Adamov about getting this presidential decree, which
Hmm.
was pretty complicated. There was another factor I'd be interested in your thoughts on. Um, Kirienko, then a prime minister under Yeltsin right during the collapse in
Yep.
1998,
Yep.
um, as Adamov was trying to approve a path forward, there was a historical legacy price of $84.50, or there was some price that had been laid down in basic principles back in
Yeah.
94, which was a
Yeah.
political marker because of this oligarchical tension. You couldn't fall short of that benchmark. And so there were clever
Correct.
ways to think about this.
Correct.
And then USEC was privatized in July 1998. And instead of that natural uranium that they didn't use to overfeed and husbanded became an asset of the corporation and was revealed in their privatization S1 filing. And suddenly the stilts were knocked out from under that path forward because it was clear that the price of natural uranium was going to fall.
Yeah.
And so, anyway, enjoy your thoughts on Kirienko in real time as well as other times that you have dealt with him.
You're correct. He had been appointed as what prime minister, I guess, was the title by Yeltsin.
It's to be a
Right.
fall guy during the fall of the market.
Exactly. He took the fall as supposedly the guy in charge of the government when in 98 Russia defaulted on its debt and um, people who were holding rubles pretty much lost everything. Um, I didn't know him at the time. I got to know him quite well after he had been appointed as the head of Minitom. I can't remember when they changed the name to Rosatom.
It's around
Uh,
2005, something like that.
yeah, yeah. And then I later on, when I left Cameco and went to work for a company called Uranium One, which at that time was still a publicly traded Canadian company, the Russians had no involvement in it. Um, they being Russia, their division within Rosatom that looked after mining issues, a company called ARMZ. They eventually purchased 25%, then an additional 26%, which gave them control of the company. And it was at that point that it was very important for Kirienko to come over to Canada, the United States, and talk to all the investors who had put a lot of money into Uranium One to convince them that, hey, everything's going to be okay. We're not going to mess around with this company. And yes, we do have a 51% ownership, which technically gave us a 51% ownership in some uranium deposits here in the United States. And, that whole silly notion that somehow Secretary of State Clinton um, had approved that sale um, in return for Bill Clinton going over to Moscow and giving a presentation at an investment conference. I mean, it was just silly. But yeah, I became quite close to Kirienko and spent a lot of time, took him fishing. He loved to fish and yeah, a lot of as I say, spent a lot of time with him. A very, very sharp guy. But he had really come out of the banking industry. He didn't know much about nuclear energy. And I think that's why going back to 98 after the fall, after he took the fall for what happened in the economy, he was able to play a more active role in making sure that the financial terms of the overall HEU agreement made good sense and to make sure that the money went back to Russia as opposed to some of it getting siphoned off here and there, which again became one of the concerns with Adamov and his crew. There was just so much suspicion there that the minute it looked like somebody else might get some of this money, particularly from the feed agreement, that just set off alarm bells. and Adamov was moved out and replaced by Kirienko. I can't remember exactly when, but it was shortly after that that I met Kirienko for the first time at a conference in Hong Kong. Um,
And he was head of Rosatom from roughly 2005. He followed Rumyantsev as minister, who was a Putin appointment, and then formerly from the Kurchatov Institute. And then he Kirienko he was head of Rosatom up through fairly recently to like 2016 or something like that when he got
yeah,
moved over to become like a right-hand advisor to Putin.
yeah, he's pretty much serving as Putin's um, chief of staff, I guess you'd say, and in that role, I think has had to adopt a certain truculence and
like
degree of
Like Medvedev.
exactly guys who I think in their more private moments wouldn't say and do the sorts of things that they've been saying and doing, and that's just in keeping with how the Russian system of government works. And you can see similar patterns in the United States where people come out very much in favor of Donald Trump and what he's saying and doing just because he is the president. He's the leader, and so you got to get behind this guy. Certainly in the case of a guy like Kirienko or Medvedev, yeah, they have to toe the line, and so they toe it quite well, and that's where Kirienko is right now.
Mhm. In terms of the money you mentioned, I mean, one thing that Putin did after succeeding Yeltsin was he took on the oligarchs and removed that internal crossfire
Yes,
that had existed under the late Yeltsin period, and then he appointed his own crew to implement the HEU agreement,
exactly.
not
Yeah,
enthusiastically to do more necessarily, but just basically um, he wouldn't do it again, but um, smooth sailing, and it's money now. They'd rather enrich their own in the future, and they make more money off of new enrichment than they do from the downblending. The downblending, as you mentioned, by the way, the natural uranium being used internally is partly because Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan mines, etc., were no longer part of the Soviet mix,
yeah,
um, and because the material was from weapons, it was contaminated with other isotopes, and therefore um, there actually had to be re-enrichment after they diluted it. Then they had to re-enrich it with 1.5% enriched new
yeah.
enrichment to get the international spec that would be acceptable to the U.S. So there was, speaking of more complexity in the whole thing, and we actually then had to have an additional thing in this March '99 agreement that covered allowing Russia to enrich that material up to that level.
Again, Jeff, and I'm glad you mentioned this because um, this provides a much better context of understanding where the international nuclear fuel market is right now. And so much of it came out of the HEU agreement. And as you pointed out, Russia no longer had Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan to rely on as a source of natural uranium, which is one of the reasons why this company I mentioned earlier, ARMZ, eventually bought 51% and then ultimately acquired the whole company. And if you were a shareholder of Uranium One at the time, you did quite well because they always paid above market prices to acquire the controlling interest and then eventually buy the whole company. And as I say, I was working for Uranium One from about 2007 to 2012, and it was shortly after they acquired their 51% interest that the head of Uranium One. I'm sorry, the head of ARMZ was a Russian guy who didn't particularly like me because I spoke Russian and I would call him out on mistranslations. And I remember one meeting, we were meeting with Kirienko, and this guy's name was Vadim Zhivov, very smart guy, made a lot of money selling shoes um, in Russia, and the three of us were meeting with the chairman of the board of Uranium One, a guy named Ian Telfer. And at one point, Zhibal was translating back to Telfer, and I said, Vadim, that's not what he said. That didn't go over very well. So, as I say, once they got to 51%, they suggested that I move on, and I did, I had a reasonably good severance package, so I was okay. It was a good move actually at the time. And as you say, Russia even now, through this entity Uranium One, which they own, it holds interests in joint ventures in Kazakhstan to receive uranium. Nothing in Uzbekistan currently, but they're struggling because in part uh, there is no feed now from Tenex sales of enrichment. None of that feed is going back to Russia. It hasn't since they invaded Ukraine. And that's causing problems on the Russian side because, again, without that feed, it's difficult for them to produce all the LEU that they had committed to produce um, prior to the invasion of Ukraine.
I'd like to come back to the USEC experiment. It was privatized in 98. Within roughly a year, they canceled the Avlis enrichment option. So they
Yeah.
had these ailing GDPs, which, as you mentioned earlier, they closed down before 2004, which was the original script for privatization.
Hmm.
And they didn't have a successor enrichment capability really in place. And as a result, over time, um, essentially over the period of the balance of the HEU agreement, went bankrupt and no longer
Yeah.
exist after 2013. And so that put a hole in the U.S. enrichment capability, which was not, I would argue, caused by the HEU deal itself. It was caused by the way privatization um, didn't meet its goals, and there were other competitors to run USEC other than going by the IPO route. There were M&A
Yeah.
options, and so today there's a dependence, more dependence than the U.S. would like, I believe, on receiving enrichment from Russia, but that hole is not because the HEU deal granted that. I would argue it was the way the USEC's fate worked out.
I would agree with that. In fact, I would argue that the HEU agreement actually not only was tremendous benefit to the United States during the agreement itself, but it also opened the door for Tenex to keep selling enrichment on their own to U.S. utilities. And that has been a godsend for the U.S. nuclear industry because there are only three sources of enrichment, pretty much. I mean, China is now selling a little bit of enrichment, but it was the French, the European consortium, Urenco, and the Russians. And
All
because the
centrifuges.
Russians were always this additional source of supply, it kept the other guys honest. It stimulated a lot of creative deal making. And again, remember, all this is still subject to the suspension agreement, limitations placed on how much enrichment Russia can sell in the United States. But there's no question that, I mean, I can tell you during the 10 years that I was the president of the Tenex's U.S. subsidiary, there were three instances I can recall where we were able to keep reactors operating in the United States that otherwise would have been shut down because they just couldn't compete in the markets where they were selling. These were all merchant markets, right? So not regulated by public utility commissions. And so they had to compete based on what their costs of production were. And without the benefit of lower cost fuel, these three reactors would have shut down. So that and that's why I eventually went to work for Tenex-USA to begin with. I knew the Russians had something of real value they could offer the U.S. industry. So I took the job believing that I could help the U.S. industry take advantage of that. And when I realized maybe 6, 7, 8 months ago that I could really no longer offer of anything of benefit to the U.S. industry. That's why I chose to resign from that position at the end of this past January. But there's no question that the HEU agreement, Jeff, it 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 didn't create problems. It opened the door for a lot of very good solutions. And again, just talking about it here today, the complexity of this and all the issues that had to be solved by the Department of Energy. Um, as I say, I don't think they ever got the full credit for it that they deserved. And I know you and Secretary Moniz, the amount of work that went into this was just, it was not apparent to the industry. And I would say that you're absolutely correct. The manner in which USEC Centrus has handled the privatization um, probably hasn't been the best way. And of course
Well, I
now
mean, Centrus is not to blame. I would perhaps, I mean,
no,
they were the successor company that tried to pick up the pieces, right?
exactly. They're, Amir Vexler, who is the CEO at Centrus, they're trying to play a really bad hand that they've been dealt. And so I think at this point, they, whatever assistance or help they can get, let's say from the Department of Energy, would be well worthwhile. Yeah, they're not in a. You're absolutely right. They've been dealt a really bad hand, and as you know, the current legislation in the United States, the Preventing Russian Uranium Imports Act, if it is carried out completely, will cut off any and all further imports of Russian uranium in any form at the end of 2027. Right now, imports are still allowed, but there's a complicated waiver procedure that you have to go through with the Department of Energy to get that waiver. And Centrus has one, and a couple of U.S. utilities have waiver as well. But that's it. Um, but Centrus, as you know, buys a lot of Russian enrichment and then resells that to U.S. utilities. And there's growing concern that if everything gets cut off at the end of 2027, that could lead to a dramatic increase in the cost of enrichment, which has already gone way up from where it was. I mean, wasn't that long ago, it was $60 a SWU, and now you're, I think, at maybe $180 to $200 a SWU. Um, and given the fact that fuel costs are 20% of a utility's operating and maintenance costs, when you push the price of uranium up that much, or the price of enrichment up that much, you really can increase the overall cost of the nuclear electricity that you're producing.
The SWU being a unit of energy to squeeze that orange
Yes.
that you
Yeah.
sampled, the more or
Yeah, that's
less
the
the
yeah,
cost of that squeeze.
it's one of these silly acronyms. It's separative work unit, and it's a measure of work in the sense it's used in physics um, to enrich uranium. And
It's
so
not a Newton.
yeah, when you buy enrichment, you buy it in units that are referred to as a SWU, or plural SWUs.
But if I could interrupt for a second and I, I, I want to take you back to the run up to the March 1999 agreement, which stabilized the swoop, the feed component, as we've
Yeah.
discussed, and also um, be interested in any reflections you have on the prospect of the HEU agreement ever being replicated under some future conditions. And then Andrea may have some general questions on cooperation, but um, after the Paris agreement on these complex issues we've sketched out a bit, um, there was a gathering in Washington at a coincident with the Gore-Cherney-Meridan Commission at the time, where all the ministers at each side, the energy, Manhattan, commerce, etc., um, would meet. But it was on the eve of the bombing uh, by of NATO of Bosnia and
Yeah.
Serbia, and Primakov, who was the prime minister, was flying towards the United States with these assurances that the I can still picture the seal on the prime minister's orders that basically dictated that only the three companies you mentioned, Cameco, Kojima, and Nucam, were the authorized sellers of that feed component.
Yes.
And and in midair, he turned the plane
Turned it around.
around. And so
Yeah.
no, Adamov, Minister Adamov was already in town. But do you have any recollections of and he was, because the agreement was so important, he was given license to go ahead and sign
Yes.
new missing piece of the agreement. From what I've read of memoirs on the Russian side, there was a lot of consternation because the whole time frame for this very complicated, I don't know how many pages, you probably know, like 150-page commercial contract
Oh, yeah.
had to be run forward and reconciled and translated. I'll stop
Yeah.
there.
It was another example, Jeff, of how political considerations, which you at the Department of Energy, you'd been dealing with for years and years, that was largely not apparent to the commercial side of the agreement. But this was another example of how political concerns became a major factor here. And I think what frustrated the Russians the most, and I know this frustrates them to this day, is that there's a feeling they're not being taken seriously, they're not being listened to. They understand as well as anybody that the United States and Russia are probably more often than not going to disagree on political questions. But that doesn't mean that the United States, any other country, shouldn't at least listen to the Russians, hear what they have to say, and at least make them feel like they're being taken seriously. You can think of it as a marriage where a wife and a husband are, trying to reconcile things, and one of them says, "Well, my husband just never listens to me. He just doesn't pay any attention to me, and that's why I shout." Uh, the Russians, I think, have never, in my experience, ever looked on something like the HEU agreement or anything else as anything other than a really good commercial agreement. There was no sinister objective here to somehow make the United States dependent on Russian enrichment. Not at all. They've always followed through in their agreements, and now there is, without question, I think, an understanding that not only does the potential agreement of another, let's say, HEU swords to plowshares type of agreement, not only is that out there, but given environmental concerns and given the fact that it appears there's a tremendous demand for more electricity, how are you going to do that without, let's say, relying on natural gas or other sources of producing electricity that generate a lot of greenhouse gases? Well, the great thing about nuclear energy is that it doesn't. And the Russians have always been big on this. I mean, they don't get, I think, as much credit as perhaps they should. And so, again, not only do you have the appeal of another non-proliferation initiative, but you also have the appeal, which might even be more significant now than it's ever been before, that you could produce this electricity using a source of generation that does not pollute and provides enormous amounts of electricity, whether it's for AI data centers or any of the other uses that we now see, that there really is this new demand. And there's no question in my mind that, again, given the right circumstances, the Russians would be willing to go along with something like that.
So this is a good transition, I think, Jeff. What do you think? Maybe I can do a couple of questions on these more cooperative dimensions of things. We are certainly very interested in what is coming, right? In what is possible moving forward. But
Sure.
but focusing on what the past, I heard an overall clear horizon, the 20,000 nuclear bombs, the importance of this transition. But I also heard something relatively new for me. You're stressing the role of the government side, what I would describe, as you were speaking, as cooperation holders.
Yes,
Not the actors per se, not the two movement, but rather this competent capacity to find solution to difficult problems that was actually very much in the government side. And I was
yes.
struck by how many times you stress this dimension, right? So that in a way is almost as if you are, positing that cooperation was actually nurtured or kept alive through difficult moments by competent people that were what I would describe as my first, coming back, listening to your presentation, cooperation holders. How would
That is correct.
how would you react to this characterization?
I think you're absolutely correct. And listening to Jeff, um, as he reminded me of all of these other political issues that came up that could only be solved by government actors. And Andreas, I think you're absolutely correct that this is a perfect example of where the role of government, which remember in the Russian mind has far more weight than the role of a commercial company. The legacy of communism and even Russian culture is that they tend to look on private companies with a certain degree of cynicism and skepticism and suspicion. And so when you have a government acting in the role of, as you say, trying to get these things worked out, that really carries a lot more weight with them. But that requires people in the government who, first of all, understand what the issues are, and secondly, who are willing to at least listen to what the Russians have to say, and then hopefully take that into consideration in making decisions that will further cooperation and, in the event of any kind of agreement, make sure that that agreement gets carried out.
Mm. With the caveat, obviously, that the government in this case must have sort of a public good orientation, right? A common good
Yes,
orientation. Otherwise, the system
absolutely.
would not work, right?
Absolutely. And that's again one of the key roles of government. I think people forget about that, or maybe they don't even know it to begin with. It's all well and good to talk in terms of what should be done by the market, private market participants, but without the role, and I think this is especially true when it comes to anything involving nuclear energy and nuclear fuel. I think you've got to have the role of the government. Um, and obviously, what we've been talking about here this morning, it's a perfect example of that because without the DOE, without commerce, without state, and a lot of other government agencies on the US side, this thing never would have moved forward.
The
I-
other
mi-
thing that struck me as an interesting thing, and I will definitely work on it further, is this role of translators. You yourself mentioned this a couple of times. Because there is an element of interpretation, right?
Absolutely.
There is a cultural element, there is the descriptive element, but also very interestingly, an element of verification. Is
Yes,
this really the situations? Do I really understand what is really happening here? Which is not just a word or two, it is really understanding the overall process and the overall trajectory of what the decision is actually making and what is the world that we are constructing while we are speaking, right? There is a connection between the speech and the action that is quite significant.
absolutely, Andreas. And I learned um, through a lot of painful study because I'm not one of these guys who uh, remembers things and, here's a word, okay, I can remember what the definition is, but, because I struggled learning Russian, but having been able to acquire a facility with the language, I know how important it is to not only make sure you get the words right, but the emotion, the context, the nuance, because it also tells the other side that I'm really listening to what they say. I get it. I understand it at an emotional level, which for Russians it is so important. There's a famous Russian author who said Russia cannot be understood by the mind alone. And I think you could probably say that about a lot of countries. But you've got to have a facility for the language to begin with, but then you've also got to be able to make sure that when you hear words, you understand how they're being used. It tells the other side, not only do you pay them the respect of learning their language, but it also makes them feel like, yeah, okay, they get it. They really get it. My daughter lived in Mexico for many, many years and speaks perfect Spanish. And I can remember taking her to a couple of meetings that we had in Mexico with the Russians, and she was shocked at how, unfortunately, poorly the guys on the Russian side just they didn't get it. They weren't understanding at an emotional level what the people at the Mexican utility were trying to say. You can translate word for word. A computer can do that now, but it's the nuance and the emotion, um, and the Russians would almost say that spiritual side of things that is so important. You got to have that.
So
One thing
I'm concluding and giving the floor back to Jeff for the conclusion, but I just want to finish with an invitation. You know that we are going to meet in June for a little seminar, a working
I
seminar.
have
I
it
hope
on my calendar. I've already made my reservations, have found a place to stay. My son lives in New York City, but I will be there.
That's great. Um, I thought I'm just on some of the points that you and Andrea were discussing there. I was on this issue of translation and verification. Um, we've talked a lot about the role of the government being a catalyst, a holder of cooperation, but I was also reminded that Tom Neff, sort of over the duration of the deal, he would be sending out memos, sometimes based on going and talking, with Rizhov or with the companies, and then he would send his memos around, and people wouldn't always necessarily agree with him, but it was on the technical side as opposed to the emotional side that you were just
Yeah,
sort of referencing. It put ideas out there and kind of established a technical, um, kind of independent look at what was going on that I think
yeah.
helped narrow the divergences of views.
Tom was a great liaison in that respect because he, as you pointed out, could speak to the governmental side, he could speak to the technical side, but he could also then speak to the commercial participants. And that that's a difficult role because typically commercially minded people don't necessarily understand what the government folks are doing. And very often the government folks don't necessarily understand what the commercial guys are doing. And so to have somebody like Neff who could combine the two of those, as well as an in-depth understanding of the technical side. Okay, how do you downblend? What's involved in that? Because that has an impact, certainly on the commercial side of things, and potentially on the political side of things.
Mhm.
thank you for
No,
this.
Tom played an enormous role here.
Yeah, thank you for putting this together, both Jeff and Fletcher, because I definitely think that there is a very interesting role for him, not just as the one that had the original idea, but also this facilitating role and keeping the process moving,
Yeah,
addressing all the issues that were presented, not just as a decision maker, not but rather as somebody that could nudge, sort of nudging the possibility of solution.
The, the,
absolutely.
the political environment was polarized. I mean, but much less so than now. And so when the solution for the excess natural uranium, the surprising amount of natural uranium that was released to the market upon the privatization of USEC, um, had discussions with Alex Flint and Neff, and the money that was put aside by Domenici, being persuasive with his colleagues, was basically to remove that material that was just announced to be put on the market and buy it back and stick it in DOE for 10
Yeah.
years and take it off the market. And so that sort of the catalytic role of government being able to operate across party lines and in a collaborative way help reset the ability of the market to function and avoid market failure in effect.
Yeah. Yeah. It did just that, Jeff. It's, as you point out, that material became an asset of the Department of Energy, which eventually was able to sell it into the market over several years. But it was another beautiful example of how the government came in and took control of a situation that otherwise would have continued to deteriorate. And again, this goes back to what I said earlier about the Russians' preference for dealing with government or government-related enterprises. There's been a lot written about criticism of the agreement between USEC and Tenex, and now Centrus and Tenex. And people have said, gee, the Russians really ought to get a different partner. Well, USEC was perceived, and I think correctly, as having a very close relationship with the United States government. Centrus, I think, has a pretty good relationship with the United States government, but it's something that they're still perceived as being closer, I would say, to the U.S. government than another company. And that is one of the reasons why the Russians have hung in there as long as they have, because again, the role of government in their mind is an important one. If you just leave everything up to the private market, as I say, you're going to end up with decisions that may not make political sense and that might complicate whatever it is you're trying to accomplish. You got to have both. And in the case of, as I said, of nuclear fuel, that is absolutely the case.
Mm-hmm. Another thing that I'm reminded of here is the complexity of perceiving what was going on in that evolving Russia in the 90s and into the early 2000s, because, as I say, I think initially policymaking assumptions was that Russia will act in its own interest. But now, with the benefit of hindsight and going back and looking at all the struggles among the oligarchs, it's not clear there really was a coherent state at the time. It was sort of more feudal fighting amongst the oligarchs.
Yes.
And partly I wanted just to touch back on a point you made with regard to Adamov being accused of wrongdoing and the like. I from my research, what sort of struck me and startled me a bit was how the issue of the shares of Orrin Benton in GNSS remained on the table as these bankruptcy proceedings played out. And even under Adamov, there was criticism of him that whatever deal he would strike with the companies would fall short of that which could have been obtained by Pleiades. And there was a point where Pleiades had purchased or sought or claimed they had purchased the remaining shares of GNSS to put themselves back in the game even after Mikhailov had left.
Yeah.
And some of the steps that Adamov took to get the cash for Menatom to purchase those shares is what got him into trouble. And because he had companies, he had set up companies in the United States when he was at Nikiet for nuclear reactor safety, and he was exonerated in a U.S. court. But it was basically, instead of the money going to the government from DOE for nuclear safety, it went through sort of a complicated chain of corporations to get around the Russian state to get to his institute, which actually worked quite well. But the complexity was so hard to defend in public that I think he and some other colleagues were accused of wrongdoing financially. There may be others that I'm unaware of, but fundamentally, I think it was an effort to protect the control of Menatom over their banking enterprise and GNSS that made him vulnerable. And so Putin removed him and put in Kirienko to
Hmm.
turn the page on that. And Mikhailov, I'm sorry, Adamov was ultimately put in jail in Switzerland after being
Yeah,
charged by the U.S. for this wrongdoing, which he was then cleared of. And
yeah.
Putin eventually um, exonerated. He was exonerated in Russia later under Putin by around 2007 and 8, and now is back working for Rosatom um, on future fast reactors. But um, both Mikhailov and Adamov, I think, were given insufficient credit of the time, trying to act in their own institution's interest, and both got shot down in
Yes.
ways that I don't think were fully appreciated at the time in the U.S. Um, but Putin put an end to the confusion about control there.
Yeah. Uh, we in the United States and I think a lot of other countries as well have a perception of Russia as a we would say a horribly corrupt society. And of course, a lot of that has to do with your definition of corruption. We have one understanding of it, the Russians might have another understanding of it, but that assumption made it very difficult, whether it was Mikhailov or Adamov or anybody else, to do anything um, involving the creation of other companies or solutions to other problems that they had to face on the Russian side. The automatic assumption was, no, 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 this is corrupt. Somebody's going to steal the money. It's not going to go to where it should go. And as you pointed out, in the case of Adamov, he was fully exonerated. But again, that suspicion to begin with made it very difficult. In fact, I'd say impossible for him to do any of these other things that he was trying to do. Insofar as Pleiades goes, yeah, they did sue. There was a lawsuit, and eventually it was settled. And Tenex, as recently as, gosh, I don't know, a few years ago, was still, part of the settlement involved Tenex selling natural UF6 to the successors of GNSS, Alexander Chernov and another guy out here in Denver, who, as I say, until quite recently were still receiving a little bit of UF6 every year that they could then sell into the market. Um, Again, subject to the Russian suspension agreement and all the other restrictions that are placed upon that. But yeah, that was a nasty bit of litigation that unfortunately came out of that. And as you say, Pleiades, I can't remember. I mean, there were lawsuits flying all over the place at the time, but eventually got worked out.
Yeah, I think Alexander Chernov, who you mentioned, was the president of GNSS,
Yes.
sta- stationed in the U.S. as sort of an aide to Tenex, if you will.
Yeah.
And the 51% shares that trace all the way back to your initial dealings with Benton, um, Pleiades claimed that they had created a counterpart of GNSS
Right.
that had only 49% shares, but under the alleged support of the Minister of Manatom, under Mikhailov, that they controlled the whole company and had a monopoly on the sales, and that was the litigation that played out. I
Yeah.
mean, and then I think Pleiades, if I recall correctly, they took their suit to after the March '99 agreement, they took it to the International Court of Settlements and the like, and there was just
Yeah.
blizzard of litigation. Do you have any comments on your dealings with Chernoff? Did you deal with him when he was still
I dealt with him a lot.
before he was locked out of his office
Well,
by his minority counterpart?
it was challenging for him. He eventually, I would say, prevailed. Now
Hmm.
he is, if I'm not mistaken, um, a warrant was issued for his arrest by the Russian government in absentia. So I
And
don't
he's an
think
American citizen.
yeah, he's a U.S. citizen now and I think he lives in Maryland. And as I say, was able to um, keep selling a very, very small amount of material. He's always kept a really low profile. And there were two Russians who came over as part of the original GNSS, the joint venture with Orrin Benton. And it was Alexander Chernov and another guy named Pavel Krupnik. Pavel went to work for USEC. And frankly, I think without him, I'm not sure USEC would have ever been able to maintain their close relations with Tenex. So they both ended up over here in the United States. Chernov, I think the last time I saw him was at a conference. I hadn't seen him or heard from him in quite a while. And he just showed up and, wow, Sasha, how are you? And we talked and I think he's doing quite well. And again, he ended up, as I understood it, in the settlement, pretty much with the control, and I guess if there was any ownership, that was more or less in his hands. And so I think he's done okay, getting a little bit of I think natural UF6 to sell here and there. And as I say, there was another guy here in Denver who worked with him. I don't know if he's still doing that or not, but yeah, I think he's doing just fine. Um,
Well, that's great. He was involved in some of the meetings in Washington that led up to Paris
oh yeah,
and the like.
yeah,
But he was un that was under Adamov. He was sort of temporarily resurrected before being subject to these other suits by Chernov, and Putin wasn't going to. I didn't think Putin was going to pay them. I mean, he just sort of slow rolled the whole
yeah, yeah.
process.
Well, I
But
remember, I knew him as Sasha uh, Chernov. He was always a great source of advice. And I remember one time he looked at me, this is all in Russian. He said, it does not pay to create enemies, right? No matter how strong you think your position is, um, you just do not want to create enemies. And I think this was something I remember hearing Vinogradov talk about on the question of Russia's involvement in completing the Bushehr reactor and taking the fuel back. And I remember I had a long discussion with Kirienko about this. Iran is a heck of a lot closer to Russia than it is to the United States. And the Russians, they know that Iranian money has helped sponsor and support a lot of the terrorist activities that have occurred in Russia, which are far more numerous than I think most people in this country understand. In fact, one of the trips, a couple of years ago, I remember where some terrorists seized a television studio, and I can't remember how many people were killed, but that clearly could be traced back to Iranian support. But all of that aside, the Russian approach has always been that, especially with a country like Iran, as big as it is, you've got to find a way to diplomatically resolve these issues. You're not going to do it by, as Chernov would say, creating an enemy. You have to try to find some way to have productive discussions, because otherwise, as Chernov would say, once you've created that enemy, there's really going to be hell to pay. So yeah, Sasha's doing quite well, and as I say, I haven't seen him in quite a while, but last I heard, he's doing fine, and I'm not sure what he's doing with his time, because I know he hasn't been selling much uranium lately, but but I think he's doing just fine.
you mentioned Kirienko again, and I was reminded that his the proposal to take the fuel that they would supply to Iran back to Russia, and not leave the spent fuel there, that came up
Yeah,
under when Secretary Bodman and Kirienko had discussions in the mid 2000s that led to an actual agreement with nuclear cooperation with Russia. So that was finally put into
yeah,
place.
yeah,
And Kirienko was very helpful, as Secretary Moniz has pointed out, in the Iran nuclear deal discussions, and taking uranium back from Iran that would put them in compliance with
yes,
their deal.
yeah,
So yeah, it's just an interesting response to different circumstances of how an individual can be cooperative at
Absolutely.
one point in time, and then have to conform to the requirements of the situation at a later time.
Yeah. I remember having a discussion with Kirienko about this. This was on a fishing trip. And earlier in the trip, when he showed up, he had this little flask. I think I've got it over here in my desk somewhere. And in Russian, it said, um, fish fear me, but women love me, something like that. I thought, well, that's really cute. He said, yeah, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin gave it to him, right? So later on in the trip, I just dumb luck ended up catching the largest salmon of anybody, and so he gave the flask to me, right? Like I say, it's here somewhere in my office. Actually, I know exactly where it is, right over there, but I'm not going to bore you
Yeah,
with
yeah.
it. But I remember discussing the situation in Iran with him, and I said, how would you respond if I was a reporter and I said to you, what's Russia's involvement in this? And he said, look, you've got to understand, we're a lot more concerned about Iran than you may give us credit for. And we believe that you don't want to make an enemy here. And that's why we're willing to supply the fuel and we're going to take it all back. And it's all done under IAEA safeguards. And it was one of these examples where I thought it was an elegant solution to what was perceived as a difficult problem. And as you say, it's sometimes a party's behavior might come across as confrontational or even hostile. Um, but if you could be patient enough and look at the larger context of what it is they're doing, in this case, the Russians taking back spent fuel from Bushehr, that makes perfect sense. And that's exactly what they've done. Um, so yeah, there are a lot of lessons to be learned here. And again, I think so much of it coming out of the HEU agreement, how that all played out, the role of government, the importance of building trust, the importance of really understanding what the other side is saying, even if you disagree with them, just the fact that you're willing to listen. I mean, I can tell you without question, one of the most frustrating things for the Russians over the last couple of decades has been this feeling that we aren't listening to them. We just discount what it is they have to say or how they feel about things. Not that we necessarily have to agree with them, but without that foundation of a person feeling like, okay, they've at least listened to me, that ends up creating a whole series of other problems that perhaps could have been avoided.
Hmm. Well, perhaps I could keep on talking all day on this, but perhaps maybe we can let that be the last word for the moment. There are many other questions I'd love to ask you about some of the people that you no doubt um, rubbed elbows with over the whole agreement, like Phil Sewell, who was present at the creation of the agreement and all the way
Yeah,
through. Lots of insights. There are other people in the industry that we haven't talked about. I mean, maybe one thought would be some sometime after the June workshop that we could or between now and June 2027, have another session with you and
sure,
give you some probably further recollections will be stimulated at the workshop, and as you have more time to look at some of the other interviews of some of your other colleagues, and things will come to mind. So,
sure.
but as a parting question, I seem to recall, and I may be incorrect, that at one point you were kind of working on vignettes of the industry and so on, and whether or not they're shareable or not, at some point you certainly be invited to share them on the archival part of the website under your name. But in that same spirit, when we come back to the other interview, having covered some of the nuts and bolts of this agreement, some of there may be vignettes about some of the participants that reveal some of their character and some of the issues like you just described with Kirienko that come to mind and
Mhm.
would lead to some kind of orderly discussion of some of the participants. So, um, well,
Well, Jeff, I would love to do that. One of the good things about having resigned from Tenex-USA at the end of January is I've found myself with enough time now to get caught up on a lot of things that I've wanted to do. And one of them is collecting all these notes that I've accumulated over the years about the HEU agreement, implementation, the problems that it faced. But if you would be kind enough just to send me a list of the names of people, like Phil Sewell. I hadn't thought about Phil very much, but
He was
I
at
got to
DOE
know him
before the
quite
agreement
well.
was
Yeah,
hatched, and then he was
yeah,
vice president of Tenex in charge of dealing with the Russians for the whole agreement,
exactly,
basically.
exactly. But if you send me a list of just the names of people you'd be curious to find out a little bit more about, I will definitely provide, I think, either information I've already got, or certainly can recollect a lot about them. And in the meantime, I promise you and Kentaro and Andreas that I will begin to assemble this collection of vignettes. And there are a lot of them because, it's been great talking to you about this today because you've reminded me of so many things that I had not thought of. The transfer agreement. I remember seeing that thing and I thought, transfer agreement, what the hell is that? And yet it played an absolutely essential role. And again, I had forgotten how important it was to have you and Ernie Moniz at the Department of Energy, who,
And
as I
Timby,
say, were and Timby over at State. Boy, what a unique combination of government expertise in the best way possible. And I think you really need that. And certainly from the Russian standpoint, if we're ever going to do anything like this in the future, and I think there's plenty of opportunity to do it, you've got to have the buy-in of the government participants here in the United States. You can't just leave it up to private industry. The Russians aren't going to trust that. They're going to feel a lot more comfortable with the role being played by government actors, especially if those government actors have the understanding that you and Secretary Moniz and Jim Timby had, and then a guy like Tom Neff, who could be the perfect liaison between the government parties and the commercial parties.
well, that's a great place to leave it. And again, Fletcher, thank you so much for your time, and
It
look
is
forward
my
to
pleasure.
Yeah.
continuing the discussion and not only about people that I might give you on a list, but there's people that I don't know about in the commercial area that were no doubt vital. And I'm sure as you have time to revisit your notes, they'll leap to mind as well.
That's great stuff. Well,
So
thank you again. And Andreas, a pleasure to meet you. Kentaro, likewise.
Indeed.
And I look forward to seeing you all in June.